I want to share with you today how to work with your air dry clay. So you might have some packets that look like this, sculpted, air hardening sculpting material. And what that means, it's clay that dries in the air like ceramic clay, only this clay doesn't need to be fired, as in put in a kiln or a very hot oven, in order to stay hard and permanent forever. However, it's not good for making like a cup, anything you're going to put water in. This would not be the thing. But for sculptures, it can be very cool. So, first of all, with this clay, you need certain materials. You will need some kind of Ziploc bag to save it in, so where you can seal it. So you can see I have a gallon bag here. It's probably way too big. If you have a sandwich baggie, that would be perfect. But I'm going to use what I have available to me. Other tools that could be helpful might be if you have one of these wooden styluses in your art kit, you can definitely use this. The point is nice. Or you can also grab toothpicks from the kitchen. Either of these will work well. I have an old paintbrush here that might make some cool textures, or I can also use this rounded end for impressing into my clay. A fork is also a fantastic thing. Not only could this make some fantastic textures, but I can use the edges for stuff. You can see this is not a fork that is typically eaten off of. It's already been used for art. But you can wash the clay off the fork or use a plastic disposable fork if your family is concerned about getting the clay on food items. I also have some paper towels handy. I'm going to use these when I store my clay. That's an important thing to consider. I have some water handy. A shallow bowl would be great, but I happen to have this cup ready to go, so that's what I'm going to use to add water to my clay. You should try to protect your surface depending on who does the cleaning in your house and their preference for your surfaces. My surface is very easily wipeable, and I'm going to be responsible for cleaning it up. If you're not going to be responsible for cleaning your own surface, then you need to make sure that you have maybe some wax paper underneath your work, or something else that will keep your surface clean and free of stains. So, once you're ready to work with this stuff, you open these packages like any other pre-sealed package, and it acts pretty much like any other clay. So some of the same rules that you have to follow with other clays, you have to follow with this. You don't have a ton of packets of clay, so you might be thinking, well, that's not going to make a very big sculpture, right? And you're not wrong. To make a larger sculpture, you can always use the pinch pot method. So something that you should have learned in elementary school is you can slowly and carefully, pressing in the middle and supporting the outside with your fingers, form air pockets in this clay to make larger and larger forms. So I can start squishing and pressing this to create something that's like a bowl or a pot, hence the pinch pot method name, and use that to create something much, much larger. So if I put two of these together, you see that I could make some kind of ball, or I could close this form and make a large like body form. Would be fantastic, and that form is much bigger than I would have achieved just by putting together the solid clay, because I have that air pocket built in there, sort of like adding extra oomph. Now, as I work with this, I can feel the surface start to get dry. The most important thing to consider when you're working with clay is the moisture content. If things start to get dry, dip your finger in some water and apply that water to the clay. That will help smooth out bumps, indents, and cracks. It does a fantastic job of creating a texture that is very, very smooth if that's what you're going for. You also use water as your glue when you attach pieces. So say I really wanted to have this body form, right? To close up this seam here, I need to score. So I can go ahead and use this tool here. Scoring means scratching or making something very, very rough, because rough things attach to each other well and smooth things don't. So I'm going to just really make this ugly and messy and gross so that these rough edges attach, I'm going to add water all along there because that's going to help glue those pieces together. And then if I really want to close this up and make that invisible seam, I'm going to have to be a little bit aggressive. Most people are just kind of afraid of the clay. They don't want to hurt it, and so they don't really do much. I need to really push that clay together, and I find that my tools are really helpful for that. So I like this wooden stylus, but you could also use a pencil in the exact same way. And this will help push the clay into that seam and merge it together so that that air pocket is firmly sealed. If we were doing non-air dry clay that had to go into the kiln, you would have to worry about that air pocket and making sure that it was not sealed or it would explode in the kiln. But since this is never going into a kiln, you don't have to worry about that. You can essentially make a balloon with your clay. Now, as I start to smooth out this seam to make it invisible, you also want to keep in mind that you shouldn't overwater. So yes, the water helped me smooth this piece out, but if I add too much water, I'm going to turn this clay into mud, and it will become unworkable. It's going to start to just make a mud all over my hands and my surface that I'm working with. So you want to keep track, sort of think of how it feels when you first open it, what that moisture content is like, how smooth it is, how not slimy it is, but also how it's not cracking. And try to maintain that same moisture content when you're working with it. Only add water if it starts to crack or if you're trying to stick things together and they're not sticking together well. Because see here, I'm sort of creating this mud, and that's probably a bit too much water there, but that surface was a little bit crackly. Also, if you have a lot of water, your clay is going to become really floppy and difficult to work with. Where I press, it's just going to smush. So you want it in this firm, but not too soft mode. And also, you don't want to let it start to dry and crack until you're ready to let it start to dry and crack. So I just made this lovely potato shape that could be all sorts of things. One thing that's very important to me is that you don't just go for smooth clay. So clay has awesome opportunities to create textures, and I'd like you to do that with your clay. The best thing you can do is just experiment and be open to things. So I'm going to go ahead and get out another piece of clay here that I can show you different ideas for creating texture on. So clay is nice when it's smooth. I understand everybody finds that feeling very pleasing to just smooth it out. But unless that is an important texture, don't just go for smooth. So you can use your various tools to make a variety of textures. Obviously, some like toothpicks, you could draw lines. This could make like a hair-like texture or another sort of rough texture. You could do a bunch of dots, a series of dots together are going to give you a sandy or a bumpy texture. But it doesn't have to be teeny tiny, so I mentioned the end of this paintbrush could be fantastic for a texture maybe similar to a golf ball. You can find other shapes and forms to press in a less random fashion and create sort of like scales. Think like a fish, or to me, I always think a dragon for scales. There's a lot of great textures that you can produce just by pressing and indenting a repeated set of lines or a set of shapes over and over and over. And the more you experiment with this, the more cool things you might discover. So you might purposely use your paintbrush to make a really goopy spot that you can then make a really sort of like rough, goopy texture with, and leave that surface that's rough to dry. I don't know if you can see that with the contrast here from the window, but that sort of rough, scrubby texture could be a great use of your surface. So consider not only building those forms to be interesting, but adding textures that are also very interesting. Now, I have just committed a very big mistake with this clay. I just let it sit there while I wasn't using it. When you're not using your clay, you're not actively working with it, it should always be sealed in your plastic bag. To seal something short-term, pretty easy. You just go ahead and you place it inside of your plastic bag and make sure you seal that edge really well. But long-term, like from one class to the next or over a weekend, go ahead and grab that paper towel or that napkin that I mentioned. Get it slightly damp. You don't need to soak it. It shouldn't be dripping. So I'm going to dip mine in my water cup, but then wring it out so it's not dripping. And go ahead and apply that slightly damp paper towel around your form or next to your form, and that will help it have a place to absorb moisture from. Now, obviously, you still need to make sure that you have this stored in a safe place. If somebody sits on it, if your dog takes it, that's a problem, okay? But I have my awesome potato shape. I also have my pancake there underneath with my textures, and I can keep this in a safe place, and it should be totally workable clay when I pull it back out of the bag for my next class session.